This video was originally posted way back on January 1st, 2012 in 6 parts. Those videos are still available if you'd like to watch them with the screen grabs, but here's the audio in its entirety, unedited and unabridged, blemishes and all. There's a pretty massive story oversight I made toward the end that I pointed out in the No Prize show. If you haven't heard about that, see if you can spot it. Hope you enjoy what 6 years younger Captain Logan had to say about this film, and thanks for listening. The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before listening to this review.
Watchmen has often been called the unfilmable graphic novel. Even now that a major motion picture has been made, some Watchmen purists will still call it that, saying that just because the thing was made doesn't mean it could ever be done so successfully in their eyes. The idea is that the 12-issue comic series, read most often now in a one-volume graphic novel, can't be completely translated to screen. Not possible. Can't be done. And these fans have a really good point. It could be argued for a couple of very legitimate reasons why the movie shouldn't have been made. First, Alan Moore never meant for this to be a film. That's the biggest and most important argument. He didn't sanction it, he wasn't involved with it, his name isn't even on it. Dave Gibbons did sanction it, was involved, and his name is on the film. Dave Gibbons, of course, being the artist of the book. He sees a lot of merit to taking this masterpiece and translating it to the film medium, which I'll get into a little later, but in his interview on one of the DVD featurettes, Gibbons himself points out the second big reason, and that's that it's a comic about comics. Part of the point Moore and Gibbons were making with Watchmen is what can be done with the graphic medium. A lot of it is about taking established superhero archetypes and turning them on their heads, doing new things with them, and using that to talk about virtually every major component of the human experience, but also to do all that with a comic book. Gibbons talks about how in a comic you can move back and forth between the pages to catch something you may have missed, refresh yourself on a point that informs something later, or just revisit a place you wanted to re-experience. You can stop on a page and stare at it as long as you like. You can experience the comic book world similarly to how Dr. Manhattan experiences his world. And there's so much detail in each panel, so many symbols to dissect, and so many signs, trinkets, memorabilia, and other things to give us a complete picture of this complex, involved world and all the people in it, that you would certainly want to look at these pages for a long time. To get the full effect of it, you have to read it at your own pace, and every individual's experience with Watchmen is going to be a very different one. Frankly, every time I've read the book, it's a different experience for me. I'll pick up on some line of dialogue or symbolic image I hadn't before, or I'll think about a scene in a different way and realize I have to adjust my assumptions and my theories because there's another piece of the puzzle I didn't pick up on before. And of course there are the unusual panel layouts and the fact that each of the 12 issues represents an hour on a clock, which references the Doomsday Clock, each hour and each issue bringing us closer to certain doom with the threat of nuclear war looming, but in reality we find it's really the threat of Adrian Veidt's unfathomable plan to trick the world into utopia. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The point is, these are things that simply don't translate to a movie screen. Zack Snyder, in my humble opinion, does his very, very best to make this thing work on a movie screen. It's not the exact same thing, and it couldn't possibly be, but let's try to look at this objectively. What adaptation is exactly the same from print to screen? Some things get really, really close, like the recent Batman Year One animated movie, but it's questionable even there as to how effective it is to translate something almost page for page and word for word from one medium to the other. I mean, what's the point? Read the book. For that matter, what was the point of reshooting Psycho frame for frame? The only difference being that it was in color and used different actors, just so you could show that it could be done? Todd McFarlane once said of adaptation that he gets bored if he has to tell the same story the exact same way over and over again, so each translation to a different medium or a different format is a chance to explore new directions. That's admittingly a little different situation, as Todd McFarlane is the original creator of Spawn, and here we're dealing with the director's vision of someone else's work. All I'm saying is that I can see both sides. As far as I understand the argument, most of the fans who didn't want a Watchmen movie weren't wishing something would be made that was somehow identical to what they read. They knew that was impossible. So they just didn't think it should be made at all. For the reasons I stated earlier, I understand the sentiment, but I can't say I agree with it. If I did agree with it, I wouldn't be reviewing the movie. That would be like if I hated green beans, which, by the way, I do, but popped open a jar of green beans and reviewed it. And then in my review, I said, "These green beans are terrible. I shouldn't have had to eat these." Well, I didn't have to eat them. They exist, and there's nothing I can do about it. So if I'm going to try to objectively review the green beans, I can't hold the fact that they exist and that they are green beans against them. And if I were incapable of putting my green bean prejudice aside, I'm not the guy to review green beans. So if you didn't want Watchmen to be a movie, I completely understand. The movie is never, quote, as good as the book. I don't think people always realize why that is, by the way. Books are longer. They go more in depth into characters' backgrounds and their feelings and the details of the world they're in. The film medium isn't designed for that. Even if this were a 12-hour miniseries instead of a feature film, bits would still be left out because exposition works somewhat differently on film, even from a comic, though not as much as in a book. When I heard the film was coming out, I was just grateful that it was being set in the same time period as the book and that it was an actual adaptation of the source material and not some bizarre modern-day update. Apparently, the most recent script before this had a major environmental slant and would have been set in the present day. It would have been something else entirely. Thank God that didn't get made, or this would be a very different review, although it probably wouldn't have taken me nearly as long to research and put it together. As always, I'm going to do my very best to be objective. The question is not whether the movie should have been made, that's clearly a matter of taste, but rather whether the film stands well on its own. This will be the first superhero rewind I've done on a movie that adapts a particular story rather than adapting characters to a new or heavily derived story. For instance, Batman Begins and Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer are each stories heavily borrowed from comic book stories, but they're taken from multiple stories. There's only one Watchmen story, and that's what's adapted to the big screen. As such, it's impossible for me to talk about Watchmen without also talking about the source material. This will not simply be a compare-contrast exercise, meticulously looking at what's the same and what's different. Rather, I'll be using some examples from the novel to explore when the movie works on its own and when it doesn't. Had I not read the book, I could review this just as a movie, talk about the story just as it is, and never refer to the book. I've certainly reviewed other movies that I've never touched the source material of. But since I love and am very familiar with Watchmen, I think it would be silly to pretend like I don't know or don't care at all about the differences. What first struck me about the film is how extremely reverential it is to the original, and often the scenes in the comics seem to serve as nearly straight storyboards for the film. And I should also point out, if Snyder was only interested in capitalizing on the name and style of Watchmen, but not to bring as many of its ideas to screen as possible, I doubt he would have made this a 3-hour movie, made a 25-minute longer director's cut to add back in portions cut for time, including the extremely important Hollis Mason death scene, and then put out a 4-hour ultimate version, complete with the entire Black Freighter story and everything else from the director's cut. But again, your enjoyment of this movie may depend much on how you perceive the world and what you believe in. If Rorschach were involved in making this movie, he probably would have strangled Zack Snyder to death with an electrical cord for not working harder to make sure the complete uncut version was released in theaters. And if Snyder were to tell him the studios wouldn't release a 4-hour movie in theaters for fear that it was just too long for commercial audiences, Rorschach would have answered, "Never compromise, even in the face of Armageddon." Fans of a novel go to the film version to see how well the characters and stories are translated to the screen. But from a story perspective, it's much more important that the piece holds up to traditional narrative scrutiny than that what we see is a carbon copy of what it's based on. After all, some viewers who saw that extremely visually provocative teaser for Watchmen in the movie theater maybe wanted to see the film, and had never heard of the graphic novel. A lot of people have never read comics, either because they've never discovered the medium on their own, don't really enjoy reading for pleasure, or can't get their minds around putting words and pictures together on a page to tell a story. And I know some folks like that. They've tried, but it's just counterintuitive to what they're used to, feels too much like reading a storyboard, an unfinished product, and it feels cumbersome to them. This is the only way a lot of people will ever be exposed to this material, and so even if it's not exactly as it was intended, maybe it's still worth it. Even with what's left out, the film asks an audience to do a lot of thinking about the story, about life, about society, about everything. I wish you could expect everyone to be open-minded enough that if I were to say Watchmen is a masterpiece, it's required reading, it's one of the richest fictional texts of last century, it doesn't matter that it's a comic book, you've got to give it a chance, they would immediately pick up a copy and give it a read. But it just isn't that way. I'm a strong proponent that it shouldn't be a prerequisite to read the original to enjoy an entertainment. To say that anyone must read source material before seeing an adaptation is taking away part of the filmmaker's job. A movie, unless part of a series, should be as self-contained as possible. That doesn't mean it's bad to include Easter eggs or homages that only diehard fans would catch. It just means that I should be able to comprehend the story without already knowing the story. If the movie can't tell the story, rather than just represent it, then the purist would be 100% correct, and it would be the unfilmable graphic novel. It's incredible that Watchmen as a film doesn't fall apart at the seams. What helps is that it doesn't try to be a comic book. It's a movie, and it's paced that way. But if you know the book, it's impressive where some of the comic book structure still works, like how Dr. Manhattan's origin sequence is played out nearly word for word and scene for scene, like Chapter 4 of the graphic novel. The non-linear storytelling here, where Dr. Manhattan recounts the past and present as if they're all happening simultaneously, is really important to having some kind of understanding of the godlike way he experiences time. Or Rorschach's introduction to a psychiatrist, where he's shown ink blot tests and he lies about what they look like, saying they look like nice flowers or a pretty butterfly, when they actually remind him of crucial, violent moments of his past that define him. Again, structured very much like the panels, where one card fades into the image Rorschach really sees. Snyder experiments with giving us key pictures like we're looking at a comic book panel, showing these important, iconic shots in slow motion so we can really get a good look at them. Again, he's not trying to fake the movie into feeling like a comic so much as letting us know what images are really important and burning them into our minds so we'll remember them when they become relevant again later. It's really hard when you're watching a movie, especially such a deep and interwoven one as this, to know just what you're supposed to be looking at in each scene and what might be important. Some viewers have complained about Snyder's excessive use of slow motion, and I'll agree that it sometimes comes off as gratuitous, like in the director's cut, where a woman gets a hole blown into her shin and her hand blown off in Veidt's building. And to hear Snyder talk about it, he'll sometimes say things like, "That looks really cool," as justification for why he did it. He sees his film as much as an action movie, as an intellectual exercise. But I think it's often there for a good reason, and I'm glad we get some time to really take in those iconic images, like Blake getting thrown into the window at the beginning, the smiley face button dropping to the street, and John Osterman getting disintegrated in the intrinsic field generator. For a person who hasn't read the book, those would probably still be the images they most remembered, just as they're the ones we most remember from reading the comic book. And that's really cool. Snyder puts a lot of detail directly from the graphic novel into his shots, and if you listen to his commentary on the Ultimate Cut, he'll point a lot of them out, like photos, signs, decorations, etc. But while I was listening to him, he'd point out things that I not only didn't catch when I watched the film, but could barely make out while he was mentioning it. They're not all necessary for the overall story. The images that are presented in a way that they're hard to miss, like Hollis Mason's Ingratitude statue, which we see photographed very large in the left portion of the frame after Mason's beat to death with it. It's an important symbol, a gift given to him during his glory days as the first Night Owl for all the help he gave the city, now with blood between the two words so that it says ingratitude, symbolizing how the city thinks about him in costume heroes now in the present of 1985. A director has to pull your eyes to what he wants you to see to tell a story, even more so in a movie than in a comic book, where, again, you'd have time to really stare at the panels and soak it all in. So again, of course, you're not going to experience every little nuance from the comic, but Snyder gives us as much as he can. It's amazing how many still pictures were taken for this film and how many small roles or even extras feel more like real people in this universe because we have more time to look at them and what they're feeling in dramatic situations, especially in the opening credits montage where we're taken on a tour of history from the beginning of superheroes through major civil and political events as they unfold in this alternate history, like the comedian shooting JFK and Dr. Manhattan's winning the war in Vietnam for us. There's even a Watchmen portraits book where you can see all this intricate detail in the costuming and props, looking more like a photo documentary of history than a fiction. It's easy to get lost in this immersive world because all the trappings are there, especially if you see the director's or the Ultimate Cut. What makes Watchmen, quote, unfilmable, at least as a theatrical film with a standard running time, is all the stuff you'd have to leave out. There's just simply too much going on in Watchmen, and to leave out any major elements overly simplifies a very complicated story with a lot of threads and a lot of ideas. I'll delve into this later when I talk about Watchmen as a superhero film, but just what is Watchmen about? It's about power. Who has power? Who should have power? Who has and should have the authority to make decisions for everyone else? What's right and what's wrong, and who should have the power to decide that? What's more important, following a certain code of decency no matter what, or ensuring the greatest amount of happiness for the most people possible? Do the ends justify the means? Is it fate that determines the course of the universe, or is it free will? Do any of us individually really have the ability to cause sweeping change, or are all of us ultimately insignificant, just slaves to the preordained will of the universe, or whatever all-powerful entity runs it? Do we each have a purpose, or do we just exist? How the heck do you deal with all those heavy questions and be an entertaining action movie and tell a story about characters we care about with solid arcs and have an engaging story the audience can follow, all in a 2-hour movie? Well, you can't. So Snyder didn't try. He took the major elements from the book, lifted as much of the most important dialogue directly into the movie as he could, and he just shot the thing. A lot was cut for the theatrical release, which is a shame, but at least it was made, and it's available. If you check out the Ultimate Cut, you'll find that Snyder made something that represents every section of the book, even if it wasn't all put into the theatrical version. It's pretty incredible that he was given the budget and free rein to put together so much extra material and special features. The Black Freighter story was made into an animated short film, which I kind of hate being released on its own, by the way, because without the context of Watchmen, it really doesn't work as its own piece, and then seamlessly interwoven into the Ultimate Cut of the film. If you haven't seen that, it's put in very similarly to where it was in the novel, framed by that little subplot with the kid reading the Black Freighter comic and dealing with the Knot Tops bullying him. Even the excerpts from Hollis Mason's book Under the Hood are represented in an Under the Hood feature on both the Ultimate Cut and the Black Freighter DVD, presented as a TV special about the history of costume crime fighters, and that's done in a really realistic way, the film quality feeling just like it should for both 1985 and 1975, and it gives a lot of insight and new dimension to the universe, letting us see characters like Sally Jupiter and Moloch talk about major events that inform the story of Watchmen in their own words. No, we don't get to see all this stuff in the theater, but we do get to see it if we want to, and it's a testament to how much the people working on this project cared about the scope of this story, that so much of it is represented. I think we have to blame the studio for how much was left out of the theatrical release. I can see not including the Black Freighter animation, which, by the way, I was surprised to find that Snyder didn't just have this made for a separate disc, but actually was completely involved with it. I have to admit that when I first read the novel, I skipped those parts, but some pretty important elements were axed, and I think it would be hard to really analyze the movie without those scenes. How can you really talk about the sociopathic psychology of Rorschach, or the realities the story points out about the sometimes dubious nature of psychiatry, without all the scenes with Rorschach's psychiatrist? How can you have a full picture of the gambit of kinds of, quote, heroes and their motivations without seeing Hollis Mason's death scene? In the theatrical version, he seems to only be there for exposition, letting us know that there was a generation of heroes before Rorschach and Night Owl, and giving us that feeling of nostalgia for the past versus this hatred of the very idea of costume vigilantes post the Keene Act. You really need Hollis Mason's worldview to contrast with Dryburgh's and Rorschach's and Veidt's, etc. Also missing from the theatrical cut are a number of nice establishing shots that help give us the scope of this universe and fun little nuances, like the several times Dan crosses paths with Walter Kovacs holding his "The End Is Nigh" sign and not realizing it's his old partner Rorschach. The theatrical cut holds together fine for the main plot thread, but not entirely for the larger ideas. I'm glad the studio was willing to let it be as long as it was, but I really think most viewers who would sit through a 3-hour movie would sit through a 3.5-hour movie. Most of what we see on screen is more or less faithful to the original, but Snyder does change some things, and whether we agree with his reasons or not, he always seems to have a story reason for what he does differently. He doesn't just change things for the sake of changing things, and I really respect that. For instance, in the flashback where Rorschach kills the child molester, Rorschach kills the guy differently from how he does it in the book. I think it's still very indicative of his character and still tells you something about Rorschach. And though I think what Moore did was cleverer, both are valid. In the book, Rorschach chains the guy up and puts a hacksaw just out of reach, the same hacksaw he used to kill the little girl, then sets the house on fire, giving him a really slim chance to live. More than he gave her, as Rorschach puts it. Rorschach has an absolute view of morality, and if you do something wrong, you deserve to be punished in as severe a way as your offense was. So this is poetic justice. If he wants to live, he's going to have to do the same thing to himself he did to that little girl. In the movie, Rorschach says dogs get put down. This man is no better than his attack dogs that he fed the remains of the little girl to, and so their fate is the same as his, and he violently stabs the man in the head repeatedly with a meat cleaver. Not the same kind of poetic justice, but there's a logic to it, and what I do like about this version over the other is the intense brutality of what Rorschach does. I can see how that might affect him harder than just leaving a man in a burning building to die. But Snyder does leave bits out that might confuse people who haven't read the book, and that's a problem. One is the explanation of why the designs on Rorschach's mask move around. This is an exaggerated and heightened reality, sure, but everything else is explained, even the transformation of John Osterman into Dr. Manhattan. Rorschach's mask just moves around. You might pick up on the thematic reasons for this, the idea that when Rorschach decides you must be punished, you're looking at yourself and your own sins in his mask, because Rorschach tests are supposed to show you whatever you need to see. But it's a little glaring that it's the only seemingly physically impossible thing we get no explanation for. And on a side note, I also personally missed that because of the reason Rorschach originally liked the way the ink moved on his mask in the book, because the black and the white never mix, which perfectly illustrates his view of the world. Another thing I don't think should have been left out is the exposition about what Bubastis is, Veidt's genetically engineered lynx. Again, it's not completely necessary for the bulk of the story, but to have Bubastis there at all is jarring for the audience if they don't know what the heck he's supposed to be or why he's there. Bubastis also served to gain a little of the reader's sympathy in the novel. Veidt cared a great deal about his creation because he was a perfect specimen, and it was a really big deal to him that he had to sacrifice Bubastis to kill Dr. Manhattan, which, of course, doesn't work. In the movie, this still happens, but there's no emotional weight to it at all. If you haven't read the book, Bubastis' existence and his death are completely pointless. There's one major element that doesn't translate well at all for me, and that's Adrian Veidt himself. The speech, the mannerisms, everything's off about him, and that's a shame because in some ways, Veidt's the most important thing to get right. But don't get me wrong, his motivations are right, and I even like the way his endgame is altered from the novel. I know some of you prefer the squid, I'll get to that in a minute. But while every other character is cast in a way where they leap right off the page for me, Dryberg, spitting image, Rorschach, spitting image, and I even like Laurie a little more in the movie, Veidt to me is simply a bad interpretation. The biggest reveal in the graphic novel, even bigger than the fact that the comedian is Laurie's father, is that Veidt is behind the mass killings and that he's devised a plan to kill millions of people in order to trick the world into saving itself from nuclear annihilation. For the moment we see him on camera, it's obvious he's the villain. That's maybe easy for me to say, given that I knew he was the villain before I saw the film, but I can't imagine any intelligent viewer not picking up on that from the start. He has malice and manipulation in his eyes, and there's a dark tinge to every line he delivers. In the book, he's dripping with charisma. Sure, he's rich and powerful and the smartest man on the planet, but he comes off as a man with nothing to hide, having given up his identity after the Keene Act and becoming the world's most beloved humanitarian. In the film, he's dripping with obvious duplicity. He does all the same stuff he does in the novel, but it makes everyone around him look really naive and stupid. He's just plain too dark. The Adrian in the comics is almost scarier because he seems so lighthearted and charismatic, even when he reveals that he's behind everything. He treats it like it's simply a given that he's doing the right thing. The film's Veidt seems nearly tragic. He says he's not a comic book villain, but his attitude is certainly befitting of one. I still believe that he thinks he's right, but it's harder to sympathize with him and consider that maybe he is right. Somehow, the case for his brand of heroism is more convincing in the book. Again, I don't think you have to know the book to pick up on this. Adrian still has that great line from the novel, "My New World Order demands less obvious heroism." But I think this movie demanded less obvious villainy. Huge strike against the film. Finally, the ending. In the book and in the movie, Dr. Manhattan works with Adrian to recreate his power, to create an unlimited energy source for the whole world. Once he's harnessed it, Adrian uses that power to destroy millions, and he makes it look like something else did it. So the United States and Russia will join forces to fight a common foe, though, unbeknownst to them, there is no foe. The ultimate practical joke, tricking the world into peace. And by Veidt's logic, the only way you can possibly win the Cold War or anything like it. The difference is in who Veidt makes out to be the bad guy. In the novel, it's a giant alien squid, so the world comes together to fight what they think are invading aliens. In the movie, Adrian makes it look like Dr. Manhattan has turned on the world, and so the world comes together to try to fight him. Now, a lot of fans of the book hate this major change, but let's look at it just in the context of the movie. Say you didn't know about the giant squid. Does Adrian's plot make sense? People have been nervous about Dr. Manhattan since he arrived. As long as he's on our side, we have nothing to worry about and no country can touch us. But what if he were to turn on us? It's that question fans have argued for years about Superman, saying that it's unrealistic that society would trust someone that powerful because he could take over and rule with an iron fist at any point, never mind that he seems to have wholesome American values. Veidt plays on that, recreates Manhattan's power just like in the book, and makes Manhattan out to be the bad guy. Snyder uses plot points that were already there to make this more plausible. He sets Manhattan up to be blamed for giving various people he's known cancer, including his old girlfriend Janie Slater. Adrian knows him well enough to know this will put him over the edge and he'll leave the planet, but in the movie, it's not just to get him out of the way, but to create a public, plausible reason he would turn his back on the world. What I think is great about this is that until Laurie inadvertently convinces him to come back, he does turn his back on the world, refusing to be around to stop nuclear war. He just doesn't actually try to kill anyone himself. Another little change from the book is that when he freaks out on the talk show and yells, "Leave me alone," we see everyone on the set disappear, but we don't know where they went. In the book, it's clear they're safe on the roof, but the film leaves it ambiguous. Maybe they're okay, or maybe he's disintegrated them. All of this, in my opinion, actually makes the world's reaction to Veidt's practical joke more plausible than what happens in the book. It always seemed a little far-fetched to me that Adrian would be sure that all the nations of the world would buy into an alien invasion and that they'd all come together to stop it. But Dr. Manhattan is something real, something everyone knows about and what he's capable of. And because he was freaking out on national television after people publicly made it evident they didn't trust him anymore, it would seem believable that he would get angry enough that random pockets of people would be killed all over the world rather than Manhattan choosing a specific target and planning out a strategy. If you were that powerful, accidentally blinking people out of existence because you got ticked off would certainly be a concern. I also like it because it better explains why Manhattan decides to leave Earth at the end. He says he neither condemns nor condones what Adrian has done, but he kills Rorschach to keep him from exposing it and decides that now that he's sure he cares about the people of Earth, he's not going to interfere. And since in this version it's him everyone thinks is responsible, there's no place for him. I think it might also give more weight to his line about going to create life somewhere else in the universe. He's seen mankind's selfish nature and the only way they can be made to get along, tricking them into it with what they think is a vastly superior power. So maybe he's going to accept the title of God somewhere else and try to create people who are better than mankind. Who knows exactly what he's going to do? It's a frightening prospect, sure, since we know from Manhattan's reaction to Laurie leaving him and his reaction to what happened on the talk show that he really is a man and not a god, just a man with incredible power, but an interesting one. And I like that Snyder expected this backlash and put a couple visual homages to the squid in the film. Personally, I actually think his ending makes a little more sense and is a little cleverer. I also think the squid, especially as a comic book motif, works on the page in a way it might not have on film. But we didn't get it on film, so who's to really know for sure? The great thing is that, except for the additions to Manhattan's overall character arc, which I find welcome and interesting, the point of the ending is more or less the same as it was in the book. Millions are killed to save billions. The world comes together because it's tricked into it, and all those people may have died for nothing because all it takes is one person spilling the beans, and we're right back where we started. It leaves it up to you to decide who is right. But the other thing I really like about this ending goes back to what I said about Todd McFarlane. Those of us who go into the movie knowing the story get to see a slightly different interpretation of it. And while all the important ideas are there, this movie has one big surprise for us as well. I really appreciated that in the theater, thinking I knew exactly what was going to happen, getting to the end and seeing something a little different, and then seeing that it actually works and adds a new possible dimension to the story. I know not everyone had that, and not everybody's going to agree with me, and some people think you just don't mess with a masterpiece like Watchmen. But I'm not a purist. Whether or not you think Snyder improved anything from the original, as I said before, I think the story is intact and can still be analyzed, dissected, and discussed at length for hours and hours. I also think the graphic novel is a more complete and immersive experience. Ultimately, I implore everyone to read the original, but I'm really impressed with how much substance is left intact in Snyder's version. I think another really good defense of putting this on the big screen is that, like in comics, it usurps viewers' expectations and assumptions about what they're watching, really makes them think about these superhero archetypes. This is another point Dave Gibbons points out in his interview on the DVD. In his opinion, it was a good thing the film was in production limbo for so many years because it feels more relevant as a film years after the fact. Nearly 25 years later, a lot of the people who saw this had never heard of the comic, and it felt as fresh, original, and as socially and culturally important as it did to comics readers in the mid-'80s. How a lot of people reacted to it is really telling about the staying power of superhero archetypes. Despite Watchmen's R rating and the way the trailers tried to make sure people knew this wasn't for kids and would get pretty rough, a lot of parents took their kids to see this movie. Maybe that was partly because it was so hyped commercially and there was so much merchandising around it. These parents obviously haven't been keeping up with the trends over the last couple decades. Just because a movie has a toy line doesn't necessarily mean it's for kids. And just because it's a superhero movie with colorful costumes, gadgets, and vehicles doesn't mean it'll be kid-appropriate. Many of those parents, disgusted, took their kids out of the theater within 5 minutes. I could see the criticism that the film was advertised as something much more mainstream than it should have been, and that some of the blame for this falls on the producers and distributors, but I also think it's indicative of how the superhero medium is generally perceived. Even today, 2.5 decades after the Watchmen graphic novel and The Dark Knight Returns changed the comics industry and showed that something more deep, philosophical, serious, and socially revealing could be done with this idea of the costume vigilante, the average moviegoer still thinks superheroes are safe. They know the formula. It's good versus evil. The good guy learns something about responsibility, stops the bad guy, we all learn a nice little lesson, and we go home happy. Even a lot of the superhero movies that are a little less clean-cut than that still portray a pretty clear line between the heroes and villains. I'll use my favorite example, Batman Begins. Bruce Wayne's not perfect. He becomes a superhero partly because his guilt and anger over his parents' death has driven him to nearly as crazy a place as the villains he fights. He nearly kills his parents' killer with a gun, and if someone hadn't gotten there first, he would have, and he would have become something very different from Batman. Ra's al Ghul is quite a bit like Adrian Veidt. He believes in sacrificing the few to save the many, even if a lot of the people he kills haven't directly done anything to deserve it. He wants to destroy Gotham to pave the way for a better future. Well, Adrian wants to do something similar, do something drastic, dramatic, and unthinkable to wake the world up and force change. The plans are different, but their principles are similar. The big difference between Ra's and Veidt are how the movies respectively portray them. Ra's is clearly the bad guy. He doesn't see himself that way. He says he's, quote, saving the world. But the film clearly sees him as the psychotic madman, whereas Batman, though perhaps more extreme than any of us would be, turns his dark side into something good. In the end, the good guy wins and the bad guy loses, and clearly we're supposed to be rooting for Batman. Watchmen allows the viewer to make up his mind for himself, because no one really wins in the end. There are no good guys or bad guys. There are simply people with motivations, though again very extreme and representative of major philosophies and worldviews. Watchmen doesn't answer questions so much as it asks them, and it messes with what's traditionally been done with the superhero genre to do that. Another point Gibbons raises is the unrealism of a lot of traditional superhero worlds, the idea that these people dress up in costumes, some with superpowers, exact their own brand of justice, and yet the world around them is pretty much our world. These people don't seem to change how society operates or how people react with each other. But, according to Gibbons, if this were the real world, they would. Watchmen has often been talked about as being about what it would be like if superheroes existed in our real world. It's kind of a superhero story, but it's arguable as to whether any of these people can really be considered heroes at all. It's all in how you look at them and how they look at themselves. Some of them would say they were heroes, but you might not. Others wouldn't be so quick to call themselves that. So before it's a superhero story, it's a science fiction story. Science fiction usually asks a big, interesting, experimental question and then attempts to answer it the best it can, keeping in mind everything it knows about the real universe. By saying, what if superheroes existed in the real world, we know we're dealing with science fiction because we're trying to put it in the context of the real world. Obviously, Watchmen doesn't really look like our world. It seems very stylized and a little foreign. A lot of things can happen here that can't happen in ours. But all of that is because the existence of the superhero changes it. With that idea comes many others. If you can have superheroes, you can have a supernatural hero. If we're going to play with the archetypes we know, there must be a Superman, and if he can change the course of human events, and if he picks a side, like Dr. Manhattan picks America, then that can have vast ramifications to how our world, or at the very least our country, operates. And so term limits are repealed, and Richard Nixon is elected for a third term because we get through Vietnam with him in the White House. Watergate never happens because of the comedian, Vietnam becomes the 51st state, etc. And the reason these people seem larger than life is because putting on a costume and fighting crime is a really dramatic and dangerous occupation, and it would take special kinds of people to put themselves on the line like that. But unlike in traditional comics, these people don't all do it for noble reasons, and the absolute only thing each of them has in common is that at one time or another, they each put on a flashy costume and hit people with their fists. So I'm going to look at the superhero archetypes some of the major characters in the novel represent, what their motivations are, and how they differ from what we generally consider to be a superhero. Keep in the back of your mind that what Watchmen is doing is trying to put these ideas in the light of human nature, as opposed to traditional superheroes, which I think often realize they're unrealistic but exist to provide role models and hope. A black and white world where we know who the heroes are can be comforting. Watchmen makes the whole thing uncomfortable, as the real world is, suggesting that those heroes, the way they appear in the comics, can't exist in reality, and uses that to explore real human nature. I'll start with Rorschach, since he's mine and a lot of people's favorite character in the book. Rorschach has an absolute view of morality. No matter what happens, he refuses to compromise on what he believes is right and wrong. Rorschach operates outside of the law because he believes it's too soft, too compromising, and turns the other way when bad people commit atrocities. If Rorschach was ruler of the world, a lot of things would be illegal that aren't in the real world, and other things would be enforced a lot harder, like child pornography and prostitution, both things we see him deal with and talk about. When the Keene Act was passed, Rorschach left a sign to be found that said never, meaning he wouldn't turn himself in because he believes he's doing the right thing. It isn't that he doesn't believe in the law, it's that he doesn't think the law goes far enough. He often tries to enforce the law, like when he tries to take Moloch's drugs away from him just because they're illegal. What makes Rorschach so compelling is that he's so devoted to his ideals and gives up a normal life for them. All that matters to him is living life as if the world were as it should be. There's something very enticing about being so sure of yourself and your convictions, and I think there's a part of all of us that wishes we could be more like Rorschach. On the other hand, he's a sociopath, and taken to their furthest extremes, his ideals are actually quite frightening. Imagine if everyone did what Rorschach did, playing judge, jury, and executioner. Even if you believed in the principle of eye for an eye, how do you decide what punishment is appropriate for each crime? And most importantly, as is the case with the superhero idea in general in Watchmen, who or what gives Rorschach the authority to make those choices? But Rorschach, of course, would say that his morality is the only morality, that's the authority, and that if everyone would just refuse to compromise and see all people as worthwhile beings who should be treated as ends unto themselves and not as means to an end, as Veidt does, the world would be a much more harmonious place. Jacob Held makes this point in his chapter on Rorschach in the book Watchmen and Philosophy, arguing that Rorschach has an extreme view of Kant's theory of ethics, the opposite of the ends justifies the means, and I agree with him. Rorschach would say we should just punish wrongdoers accordingly, never let anything go unpunished, and all agree on right and wrong, and everything works out fine. Simple, right? But he does have a point. He believes in social order, like America claims to have, but thinks that if it isn't strictly enforced, it'll fall apart at the seams. Which is just what we're seeing with all the street violence in Watchmen. No place seems safe, and it seems like no one is there to help. It seems like a reality that needs superheroes, if only we could be sure we could trust them. In the Under the Hood featurette, the newspaper vendor Bernie says if he's attacked down on the street, which seems to have maybe happened to him from time to time, and yells for help, he doesn't care who comes to his aid, a cop or a superhero, just so long as someone comes. Rorschach, like many of Watchmen's characters, is really complex, because I can see where he's coming from, and I can also see how dangerous he is. Rorschach believes in justice, as traditional comic book heroes do. The problem is, for some people, justice is hard to define, and for others, like Veidt, human life is more valuable than upholding a righteous ideal like justice. Summing up Rorschach's beliefs in relation to the moment he's killed by Manhattan, refusing to keep Veidt's secret, Held says, again in Watchmen and Philosophy, the absolute value of one's life, one's inherent dignity, stems from autonomy or freedom, the ability to act according to the moral law. Life isn't valuable, freedom is. And so, as Rorschach says, never compromise, even in the face of Armageddon. Rorschach believes society can work so long as everyone holds to a firm belief in justice, and to buy peace at the cost of millions of lives, and at the cost of making society a lie, is too steep a price. Dreiberg even somewhat agrees with him on this when he tells Veidt that he's deformed humanity. But as I said, while Rorschach makes good arguments, he goes too far. He doesn't believe it's possible at all to rehabilitate a criminal. He says of his early days behind the mask, back then I was too soft on criminals, I let them live. Batman has a pretty absolute idea of justice, too. Never let the bad guys get away with anything, but never take a life, either. Rorschach would say Batman is compromising. But Batman would say that once you decide someone has done something bad enough to deserve to die, where do you draw the line before you're killing just for the sake of killing? Rorschach's way can't work across the board, because you can't get every single person to agree with a single philosophy. And you've got to wonder how much Rorschach enjoys what he's doing. He doesn't seem to. He seems to just do it, like he says, because he's compelled. On the other hand, he knows full well when he tries to walk back to civilization that he'll be stopped and killed, if not by Manhattan, then by Veidt, neither of which he could possibly defeat in a physical confrontation. Sure, he refuses to live in Veidt's new utopia, but isn't that partly also because there would be no place for him there? Again, he's a sociopath. He sees his Rorschach mask as his true face. Without a world to show that face, what is he? Does he even want the world to really change, or has it become comfortable for him knowing he can't change the world but perpetually trying until he's dead? The other important component to Rorschach, of course, is that he doesn't believe in the idea of destiny. He thinks everyone has free will, which is why he thinks they all deserve punishment for the bad things they do. They have a choice, and there are consequences to those choices. As opposed to Dr. Manhattan, who can see the future and can't do anything to change it, and so he assumes that everything will happen however it will happen, and there's nothing we can do about it, which must affect how he feels about ideas like justice or responsibility or retribution, as opposed to Rorschach's view. It seems inevitable that Rorschach will die without telling anyone about Veidt's horrible scheme, that he's powerless to stop it until we get to the end and see that people might read what's in his journal, which has all the evidence necessary to put two and two together and see that it was really Veidt and not Manhattan who killed all those people. If Rorschach were somehow alive to see that happen, it would probably reinforce for him his belief in choice. His choices, despite his inevitable death, may have made something happen at the end. We'll get back to that in a minute. So Veidt is the movie's villain in that he's the guy with the big scheme to kill lots of people. But of course, like a lot of great villains, he thinks he's the hero. Even better, he's wearing a superhero outfit and he used to fight with the heroes he's now fighting against. He is Rorschach's opposite. He believes the preservation of human life is more important than any constructed concepts, and he believes it as strongly as Rorschach believes in justice. He also has delusions of grandeur, or maybe they're not entirely delusions, since he's the smartest man on Earth and the most physically superior, as he's fast enough to catch a bullet. Rorschach and Veidt kind of have this in common, in that both thinks his ideals are the superior ones, and that he's the only one who can show people how wrong they are. The difference is that while Rorschach doesn't expect to change the world, and how could he? What he wants is for everyone to think and act just like he does. Veidt doesn't care what people believe in, only what they believe. If he can manipulate people to think whatever he wants, he can force them not to destroy themselves. And he believes this is a noble endeavor. He says, even though it's a lie, it's peace nonetheless. Like Rorschach, we can see where he's coming from, but also like Rorschach, it's hard to condone his actions. He comes off as worse than Rorschach because of all the people he kills, but both philosophies are extreme and could never work on a large scale. But again, unlike other superhero movies might, Veidt's plans aren't completely condemned by the film. He's got a point, Rorschach's got a point, the comedian has a point, but nobody's totally right or totally wrong. Although I should mention that the most popular interpretation of the Black Freighter story is that it's a criticism of Veidt's solution. The sea captain kills a lot of people, blindly believing he's doing the right thing, until he discovers that things aren't as he thinks they are at all. The Black Freighter hasn't arrived, the dead aren't trying to kill his family, and all the people he's killed, including his family, are completely for nothing. That's the interpretation I tend to lean toward myself, though there are others, and two of the articles in the Watchmen of Philosophy book actually offer up conflicting ones, the other being that the captain is actually Rorschach, making the world a darker and more grotesque place, symbolized by the captain's disgusting raft as he does what he thinks is the right thing. But regardless of the Black Freighter, the movie really leaves it up to the viewer. The point of stories with these huge ideas most of us will never have to face is to get us thinking about our convictions, our morality, and our mortality. It's easier to get a really good sense of these differing viewpoints in extreme and unlikely situations where they come to their furthest ends. Rorschach and Adrian might consider themselves heroes, but their methods are so extreme, it's difficult for the viewer to completely agree with them, even if we might lean more toward one or the other. Ironically, in Adrian's case, if the ends justify the means, then killing all those people would only be justified assuming the world remains a utopia, and that's called into question when Seymour finds Rorschach's journal at the end. If we knew whether or not an atomic bomb drop really was inevitable, and only Dr. Manhattan could know that, but he doesn't because his view of the future is obscured by what Veidt is doing, and if he does know at the very end, he doesn't tell us, then you might think, as Dryberg and Laurie do, that it wouldn't be right to tell anyone what Veidt did now that it's over, and people do read Rorschach's journal, then regardless of the fact that he's maybe proving the power of human free will, that makes Rorschach the bad guy for destroying world peace. Of course, the dilemma of whether the ends justify the means is precisely what the Cold War was about, and why that's the backdrop for this story. Each superpower, America and Russia, trying to decide if it's morally justified to destroy the other, knowing that if they don't, the other side might destroy them. And what's really fascinating is that it comes down to the same thing with these superheroes, taking it upon themselves to try to decide what's best for everyone else, given that choice by no higher authority other than themselves. Superheroes representing the problems of real nations, superpowers with perhaps too much power. And to think there are still people who think superhero fiction is just kid stuff. The graphic novel, by the way, is on Time Magazine's top 100 novels of the 20th century. So take that, stuffy highbrow culture! There's a lot to Dr. Manhattan, and I could talk about a lot of things with him. How he perceives time, whether or not he's still a human being, the really interesting paradox in how he says he experiences time all at once, but his view of the future is obscured, but then why doesn't he remember anything from the future from when his vision wasn't obscured, all of which is explored in fascinating detail by Arthur Ward in his article on Dr. Manhattan in Watchmen of Philosophy. But again, I'm just going to focus on his superhero archetype. If Rorschach is the dark street vigilante who takes the law into his own hands, and Veidt is the corporate mastermind who thinks he's the hero but might maybe be the villain, Dr. Manhattan is, of course, Superman, or at least a Superman. The being who achieves unfathomable superpowers and the world is at his mercy. I won't talk too much about Manhattan because I covered a lot of what I wanted to say about him with my analysis of the ending, but as I said before, he's an exploration of both what a real super being who is human or had been human might be like, and how the real world might respond to him. The United States takes advantage of him, using him as a weapon or deterrent to nuclear weapons, and because he gradually loses touch with the human reality and can't feel for people as he once did, he kills for America without remorse or any feelings at all. The comedian illustrates how scary he really is when he guns down the pregnant Vietnamese woman carrying his child, and Manhattan does nothing to stop it. Dr. Manhattan is like a child playing with matches. He has unlimited power and no idea what to do with it. He seems at times beyond human beings. He can certainly do things and see things we can't, but though he appears emotionless, he reminds us that he's not when he tells Laurie, "When you left me, I left Earth." And in his anger, plans to abandon humanity, saying that Mars means more to him than Earth, and he can no longer see human life as any more meaningful than anything else. He criticizes the idea of miracles, saying that they are, by their very definition, meaningless, until Laurie proves him wrong when they discover together through memories she had never really put together that the comedian, because he raped her mother, is Laurie's father. And out of that contradiction, Laurie was born, a miracle, which makes Dr. Manhattan see humanity in a new light. But this, for me, isn't touching so much as it is kind of frightening. The implications of an all-powerful being so fragile that his feelings for one individual might make him save the world, leave the world, or potentially even destroy it, and there's nothing in the world more powerful than he is, so there's nothing we can do about it, well, that's maddening. So, of course, Dr. Manhattan is not really a hero either, and unlike the other two we've discussed so far, he doesn't even really see himself as a hero. He believes he does what he does because he must, because the universe has already preordained it. When he decides to leave the Earth, you have to wonder if he can see the future clearly again, and if he knows what's going to happen. If it'll remain a utopia or soon be destroyed. Thinking about him, again, is absolutely maddening. I can at least see a logic to where Rorschach and Veidt are coming from. Each of them at least has a code they're following, but Manhattan sees himself as a puppet, just one who can see the strings. That makes him scarier than either of the others put together. Maybe it's for the best that Superman or someone like him doesn't really exist. Now, more of Hollis Mason's character development comes from Under the Hood than it does from the movie, but even without that, we can gather, at least from the directors and Ultimate Cuts, that Hollis is the closest thing to a traditional superhero Watchmen has. He was a cop first, and so has the same values an honest police officer would. He doesn't have an agenda like Veidt or the same kind of crusade against injustice Rorschach has. In the Under the Hood feature, he says he did it because it was fun and it was the right thing to do, and he darn well enjoyed it. Which I'd say is the reason a lot of mass adventurers in comics do it. We also learn in Under the Hood that Mason was partially inspired by comics and tried to relive his childhood fantasies on the streets. Superheroes like Rorschach and the comedian didn't get their philosophies from the simple stories in comic books, and so their psychologies are more complex and their ideas about crime fighting more controversial. Mason was basically just helping out the cops while wearing a costume. He probably did some things that would be considered police brutality, but he never went nearly as far as Rorschach, and it got the job done, so no one really minded, at least for a while. It's maybe not quite fair that I'm getting a lot of my information about him from outside the film, even though I'm pretty sure it's canonical to the film, but it is interesting that he has somewhat of a similar philosophy to Rorschach's, only in that he tries to live life as he thinks it should be, rather than how it is. He doesn't like the violence in the streets, so he tries to do something about it. That's noble, and like the others, he thinks he's doing the right thing. And while his brand of crime fighting is the one I'd say is the least offensive and few people would have a huge problem with, it's inevitable that it can't last because not everyone is like him. Part of what makes him stop is what happened between the comedian and Sally Jupiter, because the comedian was just playing hero, but was just out for whatever he wanted. He ruined it for everyone else. But that's the reality of it. You can't expect every person who puts on a costume is going to be more to the side of hero than he is to villain just because he joins the team that says they're superheroes. Hollis is probably the one character in the film I'd consider to really be a hero, and there's a real point being made with his death and the ingratitude statue. Even if real heroes exist, the world isn't always going to appreciate him, and that fits back into the original big question about heroes that's central to the film's themes. Can any one person really affect sweeping change across the world? So far, at least assuming Seymour prints Rorschach's journal, the answer seems to be a resounding no. I'm going to talk about Dan and Laurie together because they're dealing with the same archetypes and also the same social themes. They're both the heroes who took over after someone else hung up their costumes and they took their mantles, wanting to follow in the footsteps of greatness. That's a motif we get in comic books with characters like Blue Beetle and even the Flash. They do it for somewhat different reasons. Laurie because it was expected by her mother, and Dan because he had the wealth to do it and wanted to do something to feel significant. Both characters deal with issues of inadequacy and feelings of uselessness. With Laurie, that's illustrated in her relationship with John. She feels helpless because John's always talking about how he knows what's going to happen and how everything is predetermined. If she's to believe that, then nothing she does matters. Ultimately, she leaves him because it seems to be the only proactive thing she can do. Get away from the person who tells her she can't be proactive no matter what she does. She says it's because he doesn't understand how people fit together anymore, but I really think it's much more that she can't stand the way he experiences time. Dan's feelings of inadequacy are illustrated by his physical impotence. Laurie leaves John and finds comfort with Dan, but as he says later, he's scared of everything, and that seems to translate into literal impotence as well. It isn't until he finally puts his costume back on and does something important with Laurie, saving people from a tenement fire, that he's able to have sex with her. But, and forgive me for putting it like this, somewhat like sex, that rush and those feelings of importance only last for so long. It isn't just the wearing of the costume that makes him feel alive, it's what he can do with it. At the end, when he realizes what Veidt has done, he can't bring himself to do what Rorschach does. He's powerless once again, going along with Veidt's new utopia because he's too afraid of dying for what he believes in, like Rorschach did, and because, I think, he's too afraid of being responsible for ending utopia and potentially condemning the world to certain doom. But we find that he makes himself somewhat comfortable with this, realizing that he can't change who he is. He's just not Rorschach, and I think a part of him always wishes he could be like his old partner. We find that he becomes at least somewhat satisfied with who he is when some innuendo in his conversation with Laurie at the end hints that he's still not physically impotent. Maybe he's not entirely a coward. Maybe there's some logic to the idea that you're less of a hero if you do the thing that condemns the world to certain doom once all those people have died and there's nothing you could do about it. It's up to each viewer to decide. These two, I think, can somewhat be considered to be heroes, though it's more of a gray area than it was with Mason. They have more personal and selfish motives than Hollis did, though even Hollis seems to admit that part of it was for the thrill. But they also do things that are heroic, saving people from a tenement fire. They also violently brutalize some guys in an alleyway when they're jumped, probably hurting them a lot more than they had to in order to come out of it alive. Is that going too far? Not intentionally killing, but certainly doing things to those guys that could have killed them. It's as if, at the moment they decided to jump them, Dan and Laurie's old superhero instincts kicked in, and those guys had suddenly given up their personhood. In traditional comic and superhero stories, certainly in a lot of movies, the bad guys in a scene like this always get up in the end and they're fine. In Batman Begins, again, regardless of all the wrecks Batman causes, we have to assume none of those policemen died in the big tumbler chase. As long as a hero doesn't intend for anyone to die, they're okay. So what if they don't intend it, but they die anyway? Does that then make them less than heroes? Again, it's a gray area. So now we come to the comedian, the last big character I'd like to talk about. There are certainly others, but these are the big ones I wanted to tackle. And as extremely long and drawn out as this review is, believe me when I say it could have been even a lot longer. I've saved the comedian for the end because he's the character that makes all these questions of heroism and ethics so extremely ambiguous. The comedian is, in a way, a combination of both Rorschach and Dr. Manhattan. He doesn't believe in fate, but in a way, he kind of does believe in fate. Let me explain what I mean. Blake does whatever he wants to. He makes himself a parody of the superhero and a parody of life. He believes nothing we do matters, and so if he can get away with it, he's going to do it. Eventually, he's going to die, and it'll be like he never existed, so while he's here, he knows he can't make the world be like he'd like it to be, as Adrian believes he can. At a meeting with other heroes, he tells Ozymandias that he's a fool for believing the world's problems are small enough for them to handle, and that when the atomic bomb is inevitably dropped, he'll be the, quote, smartest man on the cinder. The reason I say he kind of believes in fate and kind of doesn't is because on the one hand, he doesn't think anyone has a higher purpose, but on the other hand, he believes it's inevitable that whatever anyone does to try to make the world a better place, they'll fail because of human nature. As if human nature was itself destiny. You can't fight it, so you might as well give in to it. Just like Dr. Manhattan doesn't try to fight what he believes is inevitable either. The comedian is a terrible human being. He rapes Sally Jupiter, he shoots a woman he's impregnated because he doesn't want to deal with being a father, he murders defenseless people in Vietnam. He's about as scumbagish as they get. But he's made somewhat sympathetic because just before he's killed, he goes to Moloch and he's remorseful for all the horrible things he's done. He feels like he's stuck just because he truly believes that life is a joke, and there's no grand purpose or reason for existence. Obviously, he's not really a hero. What's kind of sad is that he seems like he genuinely wishes he could have been, but he couldn't because it's all pointless. The smiley face is a major motif all over the film, and while there are others I'd like to get into, especially the watch and how it represents impending doom, and Osterman's father is a watchmaker, John is a watchman, etc., in these last couple minutes I'm just going to focus on Blake's idea of life as a joke and how that plays in with a smiley face at various points in the film. Blake says it's all a joke before he's murdered, and a smiley face button drops to the ground below. At the end, we find that Blake knew what Veidt was planning, and so it's a double entendre. Blake's life specifically, is a joke. But also, he could be referring to the huge practical joke Veidt is about to play on the world to trick it into peace. Laurie's life is a joke, and that's really interesting considering who her father is. Laurie convinces John to go back to Earth by proving that she's a miracle because of the revelation that Blake is her father. You can view it the way he does, or you can look at Laurie as another joke. She wasn't supposed to happen, being born out of a terrible rape situation, and her whole life has been planned out for her by other people, and she's only ever lived in other people's shadows, namely her mother's and John's. Just after Manhattan comes to this realization, we see the smiley face reinforcing the idea of life, specifically Laurie's, being a pointless joke. I should note that while it's made to look more punctuated than it really is, both in the movie and in the book, the topography of Mars really does have a smiley face in it. And finally, the joke's on Veidt, or maybe the joke's on us. The other major smiley face is on Seymour, right at the end, when he accidentally spills ketchup on his shirt and he's about to find Rorschach's journal, just after his publisher tells him to run whatever he wants, now that the world's a utopia and there's nothing to write about anymore. That's not just there as a cute gag, it signifies the ambiguity of the ending. Rorschach's journal changes everything, especially because we can't be sure whether or not it even gets published. You might think, well, how could Seymour not publish it? It's gold! But if he puts two and two together and figures out that there's enough information there to point to Veidt and not Manhattan as the killer of all those people, this kid's got a huge dilemma on his hands. The same choice that Rorschach and Dryburgh and Laurie and Manhattan all had to make. So let's assume the journal does get published. If so, what does it tell us about the fate versus free will argument? Well, we can't be sure at all. Now, you could say that fate wins out because it's inevitable that the human condition will always win out. You can't fake the human race into doing something that's not in its nature. Sounds like fate to me. Or you could say that free will wins out. Perhaps Rorschach proves that nothing is inevitable because he beat Veidt with some ingenuity in a notebook, even if it was published posthumously. It's really all in how you look at it. And that's the real joke. The comedian, though we can't condone his horrible actions, is ultimately the most right character in the film. He may not be right that nothing anyone does really matters, but he is right in that it's impossible to really know why anything happens. We try to figure out our place in this world, but you can never be sure, and that's what he's getting at. Are superheroes good or bad for society? Hard to say. Maybe they're both, as is suggested in Under the Hood. Watchmen is all about power, and the biggest irony at the end is who has the most power. Besides Dr. Manhattan, who we know has left Earth and probably won't come back to use his powers, it's the most unlikely character, and one who wasn't even really relevant until now. It's Seymour. Like a regular, unsuspecting citizen who ends up with superpowers he never wanted or never asked for, Seymour is given this huge responsibility to tell the world what Veidt did, or not to destroy utopia and tell the truth, possibly condemning the world, or preserving that utopia. The joke is that whether they have authority or not, whether they deserve it or not, people end up with power they can't possibly be ready for. Is it fair? No. Can we be sure what the right or wrong way to use that power is? Not really. That's what makes Watchmen so brilliant and maddening all at the same time. At the end, we have all the information Seymour does and more, and when it's all said and done, when we understand every character's backgrounds, motivations, and worldviews, it all comes down to one simple question. What's more important? Life, regardless of justice, or justice, regardless of life? Wow. Just wow. I'm not going to rate each cut of Watchmen individually. I see the ultimate cut as the most important. The others are simply shorter, cut for time so they can be distributed to a mass audience. I think the comic is a masterpiece, and the film is nearly a masterpiece. Because of some exposition that's missing and probably makes an audience feel it's missing something, and for the poor physical interpretation of Adrian Veidt, I'm going to give the film a 3.5 out of 4. For a complete film experience, do watch the ultimate cut and take a look at Under the Hood, and also look for the other sources I mentioned if you really want to explore the narrative of the novel, especially Watchmen and philosophy. I know this is the longest review I've ever put together, but there are a lot of really fascinating topics I didn't even touch. Thanks for watching, hope you found it interesting and informative, and I'll see you next time on Superhero Rewind.